Well, Senator Cornyn, Senator Cruz, thanks for making time for us. You thought we were going to talk about policy. We're just going to talk about your beard. And Senator Cornyn, you're here, which is very nice.
I did need to correct Tom, though. I'm now on level 928 of Candy Crush.
Oh, that's very good. That's very good. Will you be filming any dental cleaning, though?
You have my word, there will never be any recording of me at the dentist.
Very good.
Thank you.
What a strange world. But this is actually not a joke. Yesterday, the American Dental Association thanked Beto O'Rourke for filming his trip to the dentist.
Public service comes in many forms.
They may have been the only ones that thanked him.
So, you know, when you invite a wonderful guy like Tom Craddock to do an introduction, you're in for a treat. Join me in applauding Speaker Craddock. And we will do what we can, Senator Cornyn and Senator Cruz, to have a little bit of fun on a Friday afternoon in Texas. But there are some serious questions, all kidding aside, facing Texans and facing America. On behalf of all of us at TPPF, thanks for making time for this. Both of you were on the border yesterday with President Trump, and I'll pitch this question to both of you, starting with you, Senator Cornyn. What's the solution to this crisis? It's an easy one.
How long do you have?
32 seconds.
Well, Ted and I met with local elected officials and stakeholders after the president left to try to listen to them and get some feedback from them. And, you know, I think what we heard from them is they want the Border Patrol and the Customs and Border Protection officials, the experts, to tell the politicians what they need, and then for us to deliver that rather than the other way around. Because quite honestly, I think what you're hearing is people who've never been to the border and whose image of our that unique part of our state and country is derived from novels they've read or movies they may have seen. So the short answer is the border it's important for a couple of reasons. One, we know a lot of criminal activity makes its way into the United States. Of the 72,000 people who died of drug overdoses last year in the United States alone, a substantial portion of that was the heroin that came from Mexico. 90% of the heroin comes to the United States, comes from Mexico. We know that this is rife with human trafficking, sex slavery, and involuntary servitude. People who were brought here but told we'll turn you into the authorities unless you do what we say. And then we know that our immigration system is broken because the cartels, the criminal organizations, have figured out how to exploit the vulnerability, primarily by moving children and family units from Central America. But we also know this is an important part of our economy. I think with the figure we heard from Mr. Higgerson of the Customs and Border Patrol is $300 billion of trade occurs through Texas ports of entry to Mexico, going both ways. So
it's a huge number.
It is a huge number. It's very important not only to Texas but to the country. So it's complex, but again, I think the part that's simple is we ought to be listening to the experts tell us what they need rather than folks in Washington mandating that from far away.
You know, for those of us who work in a think tank every day, thank you for that. Senator Cruz, what do you think about this crisis on the border?
I think the overwhelming majority of Texans want to see common sense, real border security. That the situation on the border.
But what constitutes the common sense?
Well, you know, yesterday I think was very productive. John and I both flew down with the president. We spent the day with the president on the border. And it started with a roundtable. We heard from a number of the stakeholders, heard from Border Patrol and ICE. We heard from families who had lost family members to criminal illegal aliens. And I think it did a very good job of putting a human face on the real tragedies that occur from an unsecured border, that occur from not screening who comes into this country and having far too many illegal aliens with serious criminal records and the people who pay the price for that. We also saw vast quantities of drugs that had been seized at the border, whether heroin or fentanyl, or we saw 560 pounds of marijuana that had been seized at the border. And that, again, takes a real toll, not to mention all of the children, all of the women who were brought in for human trafficking, who are facing physical abuse, who are facing sexual abuse. And I think the Roundtable did a terrific job of making clear this is about people. And I fully believe that anyone who is compassionate, who cares about fellow human beings, should not want to see even a single little boy or a single little girl in the custody of human traffickers. That is not a humane situation. So I think the president did a good job of highlighting that. That was important. You know, you asked a moment ago about the shutdown and when it ends. It is going to end when either the president or Chuck Schumer blinks. You've right now got the two of them staring each other down. Either one single-handedly can keep the government partially shut down. And the reason we're in a shutdown now, if you rewind to December, in December, the then Republican House passed funding for the entire federal government and included within it $5.7 billion for border security, including building a physical barrier to stop illegal trafficking. In the Senate, Chuck Schumer and the Democrats forced a shutdown. They filibustered that bill, and they said, we, the Democrats, will not fund the government if even 1 penny is included for building a physical barrier, for building a wall. Now, at this point, you've got the president and Schumer staring at each other, and somebody's got to blink. I will say between the two, their positions are not comparable. I think the president's position is far more reasonable. The president has said from the beginning he's prepared to compromise, he's prepared to negotiate. But the position of the Democrats is and remains not a penny for any physical barrier, and they won't compromise in any way, shape, or form. Their only answer is hell no. And to illustrate just how extreme that position is, this bill that the House passed had $5.7 billion for border security, including a wall. Chuck Schumer and virtually every Democrat just a few years ago voted for $40 billion in border security, including a wall. So almost every one of them has voted for legislation that was broader than this one. Their objection is not substance, it's not policy. Their objection is purely politics. Their extreme left-wing base is enraged and angry and hates the president. And that's why we're having a shutdown. And I got to say, I've got to commend the president for helping infuse some spinal fortitude in Republicans in Washington. I think it is a very good thing.
Thanks, Senator Cruz. Senator Cornyn, in light of that, how do you think we end this current shutdown? And maybe taking a longer view, how do we get out of shutdown politics to begin with?
Well, I always assumed that the people who voted to elect me to the Senate wanted me to govern and to influence the policy positions that the federal government was taking, not to preside over a shutdown where now, starting today, 800,000 federal employees will miss their first paycheck. Well, unfortunately, those federal employees, you know, they have mortgages to pay and they've got kids to feed and those sorts of things. And I think, unfortunately, they're collateral damage. And what's so disgusting about this is how unnecessary all of this is. I agree with everything, the way Ted's characterized this. But and this is all about who wins and who loses and the politics and the blame game. There's no question about it. So I think part of it is just to make sure that we elect people who understand that our responsibility is to the people we represent and to make the government function. We have some ideas about how the federal government can function better, more in the Texas model, certainly, and I'm sure we'll get around to talking about criminal justice reform and
that's definitely on the list today.
TPP's leadership role in that. But Texas has been the model for how to get the economy going again, how to get people back to work. And we need to spend more of our time implementing those policies rather than playing the blame game.
Sure, thank you for that. Senator Cruz, similar question as a follow-up, and I'm going to hypothesize something briefly. It seems to me, merely as an observer, certainly with my TPPF hat on as a nonpartisan, that there's an existential threat to the left and to the right on the border issue. On the left, they need the identity politics. And on the right, we, as is our custom, have to have the rule of law. Right. How do you settle this dispute if both sides are so significantly dug in?
Well, one thing to remember is, as on almost everything else, there is an enormous divide between Texas and Washington. Yesterday, after the president headed back to Washington, John and I did a roundtable with a number of elected leaders in South Texas and the Valley. And so mayors of small towns, county judges, and it was a vigorous, frank conversation. It was a productive conversation. Now, most of the elected leaders there were Democrats, and that's been true in South Texas a long time. That being said, I think the conversation, in fact, one of the county judges there said, look, you know, can't Republicans and Democrats work together to solve this problem? And I think in Texas we can. In Texas, we can work together productively. Some of it is even elected Democrats. They're seeing the real consequences of illegal immigration. They're seeing it in their community. They're seeing it in the narcotics being trafficked through. They're seeing it in the human lives that they're seeing it if you go to Brooks County and you talk to the farmers and ranchers there that tragically encounter over and over again dead bodies of children, of pregnant women that the coyotes have just abandoned in the summer heat and have died on the way into this country. They see it on the ground. And you know, border security used to be something you could find bipartisan agreement on. National politics has changed, and I think with the election of Donald Trump, on the Democratic Party, the extreme left, they've lost their mind. I mean, they have gone bat crap crazy. And so, you know, their rising superstar is a self-proclaimed socialist from New York who ran on a platform of abolishing ICE, of abolishing the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. And what you're seeing now, you know, they're having discussions about let's raise the top tax rate to 70 or 75%. In that environment, I think the Democratic leadership feels captive. I think they've unleashed the demons of the extreme left in their party. And so how many of y'all watched the president's speech to this country and then after that, the fairly remarkable address from Schumer and Pelosi? Now, I got to say, I told the president yesterday on Air Force One, I said, you really need to send Nancy Pelosi 3 dozen roses. Because I said, listen, Mr. President, I thought your speech was really good, but frankly, they were much more effective making our case than you were. And I got to say, that video, to me, the internet has had a lot of fun doing a gazillion memes on that, whether American Gothic or the 2 kids from The Shining. Those were a couple of the more interesting ones. But to me, the thing looked like a hostage video. You know, with the grainy coverage. And by the way, try this when you get home. I'm pretty certain if you slow it down, you can see Nancy blinking SOS while Chuck is speaking.
You know, we assume that having 2 wonderful members of the Senate would be newsworthy. I think it's even more so now. So thanks for that. All kidding aside, though, I think it's really important. We spent a lot of time this week prior to the 2 of you joining us speaking about civil discourse and the importance in a healthy civil society of being able to disagree. And part of that is just having some good, honest laughter when any of us are in a situation that can somehow be funny. That's not a lead-up, Senator Cornyn, to anything.
All right, so how many radical leftists does it take to screw in a light bulb?
You tell me, Senator.
That's not funny!
I think you've triggered me. It reminds me of being in faculty senate meetings during my days in higher ed, which is why I like being in public policy. I don't even know what I was going to ask you. What I was going to say is my comment about laughter was not a lead up to ask you a follow up to anything Speaker Craddock said. It was a serious question. Senator Cruz referred to leadership, and you've just concluded wonderful service as Senate Majority Whip. Thank you for that. And it's a question. As an outsider, that just seems like a thankless job, but a very important one. And
you're pretty much right.
Sure. We're grateful here in Texas and beyond for your service there. It's a question about reflecting on that, and you're still in a senior leadership role. What did you learn during that experience that will help you guide us out of this crisis, whether it's the border security crisis or the shutdown crisis, and maybe get us to a point where we can be talking about substantive policy solutions?
Well, it is important to have civil discourse, to be sure. In the legislative branch, as Tom Craddock or any of the legislators here will tell you, it's about building consensus. And you're right, we come from very different perspectives. But it's one of my colleagues, Mike Enzi, our colleague Mike Enzi, talked about the time that Teddy Kennedy, the liberal lion of the left, and he were on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. I asked Mike, I said, well, how is it that you and Teddy Kennedy, of all people, are able to work together so productively? And he said, well, it's the 80-20 rule. It's the 80-20 rule. We work on the 80% of things we can agree on, and the 20% we can't, we leave to fight about another day. But I have to say that this probably has gotten lost in all the drama associated with Washington, D.C. these days. But we just got through with 2 of the most productive years in the Congress since I've been there, ending with the flourish of the First Step Act, but the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the regulatory rollback. We passed major opioid reform legislation. I mean, you just go down the list, and the economy is growing again, as you may have noticed. People have confidence in the future. The stock market is at historic highs. So actually, when you look at the results that are occurring there, the results have been pretty darn good. But Ted's right about the left's antipathy for Donald Trump. They don't want to give him any wins on anything, which means it's very hard for us to do things like confirmed judges or cabinet members. By the way, thanks to the voters in our great country giving us 53 senators, we're going to be able to confirm a whole bunch of federal judges. Ted and I worked hand in glove with the White House to put 3 new Texans on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, some outstanding people. And now we have a total of 12 vacancies at the district court level that we're going to move through. Unfortunately, because of Chuck Schumer and his obstruction, we were unable to get 4 of those through that were teed up to be confirmed. But they're coming back here in a matter of days, and then we'll add to those 4 the other 8. And I think that will be one of this president's legacies that will far outlive his term of office. Really the transformation of the federal judiciary, not people who think that they're policymakers wearing black robes with life tenure that you can't vote out of office, but rather people who believe in the rule of law and believe in the limited, albeit important, role of the federal judiciary. So those are some of the things that I'm proudest of. We did stub our toe big time. You remember the John McCain?
At TPPF, we remember that moment really well.
I was standing there, and I don't know if you saw the look on my face when he did it, but it was very disappointing, to say the least. And certainly healthcare remains one area that we have a lot of work to do, hopefully getting it back to more market-driven solutions. But the good news is, instead of the 51 or 50 senators we had on our side, now we're up to 53. And so I think there's a lot of work we can do, even with the House now being led by Nancy Pelosi, hopefully on things like infrastructure, which seems to have broad bipartisan appeal, and of course, confirm a lot of judges. I wish Ruth Bader Ginsburg a long and happy life. hopefully in retirement. And so this, I think we'll have the opportunity probably during the president's first term, perhaps.
You know, I think she would make an excellent ambassador to pretty much any country on earth.
She's a smart gal. We do wish her well. And Senator Cornyn, you set the table for a number of policy issues I just want to touch on briefly. But Senator Cruz, let's talk about the issue of judges. And in particular, to sort of wed the issue of judges with the issue of civil discourse. As a historian of this country, I don't think in my lifetime I have been more horrified at the level of discourse that happened during the hearings surrounding Justice Kavanaugh. And I want to thank you genuinely, Senator Cruz, Senator Cornyn, for your leadership in getting that done. And I use the word horrified on purpose. It really is that terrifying. How the next time, hoping that Justice Ginsburg and the entire court is very healthy, there will be a vacancy in all likelihood. How will we avoid that kind of conversation again?
Look, the deterrent effect that may have had, you have to wonder who in their right mind would put themselves up for that. Right. I suspect there are more than a few of us that watched that and immediately went home and burned our high school yearbooks. There was a viciousness to that you saw a willingness of Senate Democrats to smear Judge Kavanaugh, to smear his family, and to traffic in allegations regardless of whether there was any corroboration, regardless of whether there was any basis for it. In fact, a number of the allegations that were lodged at the time have since been referred to the Department of Justice for prosecution because the witnesses have recanted or it's become evident that the allegations were demonstrably false. But you saw zero interest in part of the Senate Democrats in any of that. They had a job to do, which was to just go into the gutter against Judge Kavanaugh, and that's what they did. And it, you know, I will say it is in many ways an absolute miracle that Senate Republicans held firm.
There was a lot of pressure not to.
I think the Democratic plan was just make it so ugly, turn it into such a circus that they counted on us going wobbly. And I think the president stood firm. I'll say Mitch McConnell did a very good job, particularly with some of our members who were more wobbly, of just holding their hands and saying count to 10 and then keep counting. But we held firm, and I think that was a good thing. Now, part of the challenge, and we'll see this next week. John and I are both on Judiciary. We're going to have confirmation hearings for the new Attorney General nominee, Bill Barr. I expect another circus. I don't think it'll be as bad as Kavanaugh, but I think you will see Democrats putting on a show. Now, part of the problem is it seems like almost every Democrat on Judiciary is running for president. Right. Now, look, I'm not necessarily criticizing that, you know, glass houses and all, but the dynamic back and forth between them, they're auditioning for their extreme left-wing base. Right. Oh, you can be a crazy lunatic. I can be even crazier than you are. By the way, for the record, neither John nor I are Spartacus.
Thanks for that clarification.
Look, we were both sitting there during the Spartacus moment, and we're all looking at each other going, what?
Orrin Hatch said he knew Spartacus.
Senator Cornyn, kind of hanging on that for a moment. Can we break the logjam on the nominations for lower level courts?
Yeah, I think we've really gotten to the point of maximum frustration at the foot dragging on the nominations. I mentioned 4 of the judges in Texas who'd been nominated but who weren't able to be confirmed before the end of the Congress have now been sent back. That happens at the end of each Congress and has to be resubmitted. And there are a lot of ambassadors and executive branch nominees that simply didn't get confirmed. And so this is kind of the passive-aggressive part of the resistance to Donald Trump. In other words, trying to undermine his administration in such a way that he doesn't even have his own team on the playing field. So But we have talked about the possibility of changing the rules this is, the Senate, as Senator Graham will tell you, is a place where the rules are traditionally honored in the extreme, and our precedents are honored. Now, we did find the need to have to break those precedents to get Neil Gorsuch confirmed with 51 votes, but I think you'll see some action by the Republican conference to limit the amount of post-cloture debate, not to get too far down in the weeds, but to quit allowing them to just needlessly delay these nominees and then vote to confirm them 99-1. They're not necessarily controversial. It's obvious what they're trying to do. So that's going to be a serious subject that we're going to take up very quickly next week or perhaps the week after.
Good. Thank you. I know what y'all know. People in this audience watching the live stream care deeply about that because it's a matter of justice, pardon the pun. Let's go to the other side of the spectrum. We're talking about the difficulty in working together across the aisle. And yet, as you alluded to, Senator Cornyn, there has been a great act passed in the First Step Act. And I say that not just because criminal justice reform, as we now know it, was birthed in part by the Texas Public Policy Foundation, but thank you. You know we're happy not to get any credit. You're the guys who take the hard votes. The point is that there will be thousands of Americans who have their lives bettered by this, and not just those who are going to benefit from reentry programs, but those of us who are going to be in civil society with folks who've served some time. And so I just want to take a moment on behalf of grateful state and nation to thank you both for your leadership in getting that passed. Senator Cruz, is there an issue like that on the horizon where both sides can come together and work together civilly?
You know, there may be, and there have been other issues. It's interesting in the Senate, as I look forward for the next 2 years, and I've sat down with my team and said, okay, we've got the Pelosi House, we're going to have nonstop investigations, impeachment, all of that is coming. Even in the face of that, I think there still will be what I call rifle shot bills that can get bipartisan support and get through. So, for example, last month, I passed 3 bills into law. Now, that didn't get a lot of attention, but they were exactly the sort of, so one was the NICA bill, which was bipartisan legislation that imposed sanctions on Nicaragua and put pressure on Ortega and the communist regime there and uses the U.S.'s leverage with the international financial institutions to press for democratic reforms and human rights in Nicaragua. A second bill that I authored and passed was the Human Shields legislation that put in place, it responds to Hezbollah and Hamas and other terrorists that use human shields as a tactic of war against Israel, against the United States. And it imposes sanctions and uses the leverage we have to go after any entity, be it a terrorist organization or a nation state, that uses human shields. That passed into law. And then the third legislation was legislation called the Cold Case Act, which Doug Jones, Democrat from Alabama, he was the lead author of that. It's actually an interesting story. So I was presiding. The way it works, if you're more junior, you share turns in the presiding chair. And so I was sitting there presiding, and usually when someone speaks in the Senate chamber, it's empty. By the way, like images of it as a great, debating society, that is not the U.S. Senate. You're normally talking to 99 empty chairs. But Doug was standing there talking about his legislation, and I was sitting in the presiding chair, and he talked about its legislation focusing on cold cases from the civil rights era. So church bombings, racially motivated murders that happened in the 1950s or 1960s that are unsolved. And sadly, in our country, there's a horrific record of some bigoted, racially motivated violence that's never been solved. And what this legislation does is seek to make public those records, to enable people, to enable citizens to go do research, to enable journalists to go do research and see if you can solve a murder that happened 50 years ago. See if that information can track down whoever committed that crime. And so I listened to Doug's speech, and after he finished, I went up and said, Doug, that makes a hell of a lot of sense. Why don't we join together and get it passed? And so we did. We passed it through the Senate, passed it through the House, and just 2 days ago, President Trump signed it into law. So there are things you can do. There are things you can do that they're not as paradigm shifting as the tax cut, but they're meaningful, they're important, and you can move them through. Space is another area. I've been very, very active. I've chaired the Space Subcommittee for a number of years. We keep passing bipartisan legislation, expanding America's leadership in space, expanding commercial space, which produces tens of thousands of jobs in the state of Texas. So all of those will continue. But that being said, my optimism for major structural legislation that will impact our economy in a big way, my optimism level is not high, because I think these House Democrats, in The Godfather, they talk about a wartime consigliere and a peacetime consigliere. These House Democrats are governed by wartime consiglieres. They are marching on the walls and with pitchforks and torches in their hands. So I don't think we're going to see a lot of willingness to work together on big legislation. John, do you have more optimism than I? I'd be encouraged if you did.
I'm just an optimistic kind of guy, which is to say I'm a Texan, right? Texans are all optimistic. So, it's interesting. I was thinking as Ted was talking, there's a lot of examples of what I would call singles, maybe an occasional double, and then there's the grand slam home run. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was, in the latter category. But we did some other things like the First Step Act, which got, close to 90, more than 80 votes, about 80 votes, I think. Huge bipartisan victory. We also did something that you probably never really paid much attention to unless you've been a student of the federal government, but something called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. There's growing recognition that China is becoming more and more of a economic and military threat to the United States. Obviously, the belligerents you see on the South China Sea, blocking some of the trading routes and expanding their territory, but their theft of U.S. intellectual property is just routine now, and anything they can't steal, they will try to exploit gaps in our foreign investment rules and get access to not only the intellectual property but also to the know-how to build it in China. It's part of their China 2025 policy. So we were able to pass this major reform to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to police and prevent that sort of exploitation by a huge bipartisan majority. But as Ted says, these are not the things that we fight about so much publicly, so you're less likely to read or hear about it. But on this sort of small but significant sort of legislation that we are able to do almost on a routine basis, I'm thinking, Ted, for example, like the reduction of the rape kit backlog.
Yes.
About 400,000 untested rape kits sitting in evidence lockers or in police or in laboratories that could not only identify the assailant in a sexual assault, but also exonerate a person who was falsely accused. We were able to pass major reform of that and provide additional funding that targets testing those rape kits.
That legislation like that is important, and congratulations. We have waning time, and I want to cover a really easy question. Obamacare. So let me just frame it briefly and pitch to each of you on this, because I know this is a huge issue, to say the least. We've won one major step in a lawsuit against Obamacare. There's a poll that was released this morning that shows 6 out of every 10 registered voters wants that decision to be upheld. That means that those of you who have the privilege and the duty in elected office probably will have some decision to be made, both at the federal level and the state level, right? What can be done if, in fact, that lawsuit decision is upheld?
Well, I'll start. Since the travesty known as Obamacare was foisted on the American people, we have made some progress. We have not been able to do, as I indicated earlier, everything we wanted to do by repeal and replace, but we have been able to dismantle brick by brick. We literally have repealed the individual mandate, which is the penalty against middle and low income people who couldn't afford the inordinately expensive policies. But part of the problem now is that the marketplace was devastated because they were basically, any alternative policies were essentially ruled were illegal. So now the administration has begun through the Department of Labor some what are known as association health plans. For example, if you're a member of the Texas Realtors Association or the Texas Restaurant Association, people can band together and get what are employer priced health insurance rather than have to rely on the individual market. We've also seen some of these temporary policies when people are in transition between jobs, more widely available, up to a year at a time, I think renewable up to 3 years. But what we're trying to do is give people choices, because I think that's ultimately what provides the discipline when it comes to price and quality is to give consumers those choices, rather than to do what the Obama administration did, was to dictate a one-size-fits-all and cross-subsidize, basically imposing on young people the cost of providing health care to older people who normally would ordinarily be charged more. And a lot of young people simply did not buy it and were subject to the individual mandate. All of which is to say that I think we've evolved, but we're not quite to the place where we have that robust individual market that I think we need in order to give people the choices at a price they can afford.
Sure. Thanks for your response. Senator Cruz?
So I think there's a lot we can and should do about Obamacare. Let's start with the problems. Obamacare isn't working, and it is hurting millions of Texans and millions of Americans. How has it hurt them? It has hurt on the job front. It has forced people out of jobs. It has forced people from full-time into part-time work. But the most significant way in which Obamacare has caused harm is that it has driven premiums through the roof. The average family's premiums under Obamacare have risen over $5,000 a year. By the way, Obama promised the average family's premiums would drop $2,500 a year. So in terms of how it was marketed and sold, it's a world of difference. I hear from Texans, John hears from Texans across the state over and over and over again, I can't afford health insurance for my family. The premiums are too high. We've got to fix that. Now, how do you fix that? This is something TPPF understands, basic economics. If you want prices to go down, you want more choices, more competition, more options, and more consumer freedom. That's how you get prices to go down. What Obamacare does, very simply, is it has less choices, less competition, less option, less consumer freedom, and as a result, the prices go up. That is the fundamental problem. Now, in the last Congress, we came very close. The biggest unfinished commitment of the last Congress was repealing Obamacare. And I spent thousands of hours over the last 2 years working to try to get to 50, to get that done. One component of that bill that I authored was something called the Consumer Freedom Amendment that said that if an insurance company offers any health insurance plan in a state that meets the Title I mandates, that meets pre-existing conditions and everything else, that they can also offer any other plan that consumers desire. HHS scored the Consumer Freedom Amendment and found that it would reduce people's premiums by an excess of $5,000 per year, simply allowing freedom. And that's true both for those with pre-existing conditions and those without. It would keep the protections but lower premiums. That was in the legislation. It was adopted in the legislation that tragically failed by a single vote at the Senate floor at 2 in the morning. That was a heartbreaking moment for a lot of us. Now, we did end up accomplishing something people didn't think we could do, which is, as John mentioned, we repealed the Obamacare individual mandate. We did that a few months later as part of the tax cut. That was something, again, I led the charge to repeal the individual mandate. And I got to tell you, I remember the first few lunches bringing it up. There were maybe a half dozen conservatives in a room of 51 Republicans who were supporting repealing the individual mandate. I mean, it is a friggin' miracle that we got that done. But we ended up bringing the conference together, producing consensus, and at the end of the day, all 52 Republicans in the conference at that time, every single one voted to repeal the individual mandate, and we succeeded on that. That was a major victory.
Thank you.
We need to keep going. It is going to be exponentially harder with the Democratic House because Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic House have zero interest in expanding competition, expanding options, reducing regulations, or lowering premiums. And indeed, what you see about congressional Democrats is that they are figuratively and at times quite literally in bed with the giant insurance companies. And by the way, the giant insurance companies, I debated Bernie Sanders on this on CNN last year. The Democrats love to use populist rhetoric, but a great question to ask them, Bernie, the top 10 insurance companies in 2008, their annual profits were $8 billion. By 2015, after Obamacare passed, they were $15 billion. You guys are enriching a handful of giant insurance companies, and you are hammering single moms and young people and working people across Texas and across the country. Unfortunately, that's where the Democratic Party is. So we need to keep fighting for those reforms, but I think in the Democratic House, they are not going to have any interest in working with us. So the real answer is retire Nancy Pelosi, send her and Ruth Bader Ginsburg on a vacation, retake the House, and then finish the job and repeal the train wreck that is Obamacare.
Thank you. We could spend all afternoon speaking with each of you. You've been kind with your time. This has been an outstanding conference.
Tom Craddock asked that we not do that.
Yes, I know. We need to do an intro for him sometime, like that. But
I will tell you a true Tom Craddock story. So,
make it brief.
I'll make it brief. So when I'm working in the AG's office, working for Greg Abbott, and by the way, he told the story and said I walked into his office and called him Tom. Now, I'm 33 years old, a staffer at the AG's office. Who here thinks I'm lunatic enough to call the speaker Tom? I'm scared to do that now. But we were sitting there with then General Abbott, and there was, I don't remember what the issue was, but there was some decision that the Attorney General had to make, and it was in conflict between the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker. And it was a binary choice where whatever the AG did, one was going to be happy and one was going to not be happy. And we're sitting there and we're thinking through, then I'll tell you what Abbott said at the end of the day. He said, look, if we go against Craddock, he'll hunt you down and kill you. So let's go his way. And that was a real conversation.
I bet there's no exaggeration in that whatsoever. Well, thanks, Senator Cruz. Senator Cornyn, to this audience here with us presently and those live streaming, you're our senior senator. You've been in a position of leadership. We want to give you the last words here. And what I'm soliciting here is advice for those of us who are not in elected office. However, we're very involved in the public square. What can you tell us that we should be doing, not just in the next week, as we're on this high following policy orientation, but for the next year, the next few years? Because at TPPF, we're always looking for that action step of how we can get a little more involved.
Well, I think as Ted's campaign demonstrated, we're going to have a monumental battle again in 2020. And I think the challenge we are going to have is how do we maintain the Texas model and the Texas example for the rest of the nation, that we can then hold up and say, we've tried this in the laboratory of democracy known as the states, and we found that it works, and now we think it's battle tested and ready for the nation, like criminal justice reform. If we don't do our best to come together and be unified and to learn the lessons that I think the voters were trying to tell us in 2018, then we may not be in a position to do that. And I'm not suggesting that everything is at stake, but the one thing that does keep me awake at night is if we lose Texas, we will never elect another conservative president in my lifetime. And so we do need to have that sort of civil disagreements from time to time. Sure. Even my wife of 39 years and I have disagreements from time to time. She's always right. But the point is, not everything is a matter of principle. And on things that are not matters of principle, we need to find a way to unify and work together, because we know what our adversary looks like and where they want to take the country. And Texas is going to be that battleground in 2020. That's what I'm focused on. And I would encourage all of us to think about and work together toward that goal to maintain this great Texas model. And the way we do that is by winning 2020.
Thank you. With that, and this excellent conversation, the largest ever policy orientation, 1,300 people, has concluded. Senator Cornyn, thank you and God bless you.
Thank you.
Senator Cruz, thank you and God bless you. Y'all join me in congratulating our senators.